Hello my friends, Jerry Rosa here in the Rosa String Works workshop. I'm in Studio M, which is the metalworking side, affectionately known as the dark side. And I don't call it the dark side because there's no light, I call it the dark side because it's dark, dingy, dirty, greasy. You can't be over here without getting your hands black. And it don't take very long either. We're here today to talk about some common sense ways to learn how to weld. Now, this is common sense. This is not the technical guidelines and all of the know-it-all type welding stuff that you see out there on these welding videos. For somebody who's just wanting to get started on their own, most of that stuff's pretty intimidating. You think, well, you got to have the best of this and the best of that, and you got to know this kind of metal does this kind of thing, and it ain't like that. It's really very straightforward, very simple. Almost anybody watching this video could do this. And I say almost, meaning pretty much anybody can do this. There's just a few things that really you need to know when you first get started. Just a few things. I mean, there's some danger involved. I mean, you know, you're dealing with electrical and you can get shocked, and there's different things, and we're going to talk about that real quick. It's not that complicated though, and it's not that dangerous. So don't get all up scared thinking that you're going to get shocked. You won't if you pay attention to do what I tell you. We're going to be featuring this little Art Captain MIG 145 Pro as our welder. Art Captain sent this welder to me. I've already made my commitment to Art Captain. I don't have to show this welder off in this video, but I think it's a very nice little welder, and it'd be a great welder for anybody who wants to get started, because not only can it arc weld, it can also do a lift start TIG, and it can also do flux core wire feed welding, which is most people refer to as MIG welding, though in true MIG welding, I guess you'd say you would be using gas. Well, this uses flux core wire instead of gas, and it works really well. It's kind of become my de facto welder. It's so lightweight and so easy to get around. If I have something outside the doors here where I can't get to my big welder, you know, easily, well, then I just take this one out there and weld with it. You can plug this thing in pretty much anywhere and weld, and it does a really good job. Okay, enough said about the welder. I just wanted to tell you up front that they gave this to me. I'm using it. I've already met my commitment to them, so I wouldn't have to tell you all this unless it was true. All right, we're going to get into all that right after this. Okay, I've moved over here to my welding table area, and we're going to talk about welding tables and all kinds of things in this video. But first of all, I mentioned that there are some safety things, and the first one is welding gives off a lot of fumes and gases and smoke and all that kind of stuff. So you want to do it in a good, well-ventilated area. You want to try to avoid breathing it in any more than you have to. It's a good idea, if you can, to just turn on a small fan and have it blow across your work area. It won't hurt nothing to do that, as long as, you know, I mean, there are certain circumstances where you don't want any breezes, but we're not going to be into those circumstances on this first video. Having said that, well ventilated, have your garage door open, that kind of thing. As I tell you that, I'm in an enclosed room right now. I'm not going to weld very much. I'm just going to demonstrate a few things, so I'm not too worried about it. But if it does get a little bit smoky, I'll be opening these doors. It's kind of cold outside, so that's the only reason I haven't done it yet. So that's safety thing number one. Safety thing number two, it's just like any other common sense safety thing when you're dealing with electric. You probably don't want to deal with electric welding or anything else electric when it's real wet. You know, if your floor is really wet, it's probably not your best time to be welding. You know, if you've just washed out your garage floor, now you're standing in that water, it's probably not your best choice. So, you know, it's not that you can't do it. People do it all the time. But I would take real precautions. If you were going to have to do welding in a damp environment, I would get a good dry piece of plywood or something to stand on. Something like that. Just take good common sense precautions. That's all you got to do. The next thing about getting shocked or whatever is the ground. You do have a ground cable on a welder, and you want to make sure you're getting a really good ground to the thing you're welding. Again, if you're in a wet environment and your ground is not real good, that's when you most likely get shocked because you become the ground, see? So make a good ground connection. Clean off the area that you're going to use your ground clamp on. In other words, if you're getting ready to weld a rusty piece of steel, take a wire brush, wire wheel, whatever, clean that rust off down to the bare metal. Sander, whatever it takes to clean the metal off, clamp your ground right there, then you won't have any problem with your ground. It's just that simple, just that common sense. Just clean it off, clamp your ground on, and you're good to go. Let's turn it down here and we'll show you what we're dealing with. All right, so here's my ground clamp. I have a steel welding table. The steel is pretty clean, so I've got the clamp clamped right here. So that's a good ground. Most of these welding electrodes have, arc welding we're talking about, of course. They have multiple ways you can grab this electrode. You can grab it straight like this, or my preference is to grab it on this angle. I like the angle. Not everybody does. A lot of people do like it straight. And quite honestly, for starting off, you might be better off using the straight. So in other words, it's at a 90-degree angle. So a straight 90-degree angle there. Or, like I said, I often use what I would say is probably a 45-degree angle. But that's just personal preference. Like I said, for today's demo, we're going to be using it squared off 90 degrees. You don't have to go to extremes on this. When you're just welding steel, you want your steel relatively clean. And when I say relatively clean, there's going to be people just screaming at the video saying, you're an idiot, you want it perfectly clean. Well, yeah, okay, just clean it off. That's all I'm saying. Take a wire wheel, wire brush, make it relatively clean. You don't have to kill yourself making it perfect. Now, on some kinds of welding, like if you're doing aluminum or if you're doing TIG welding, well then cleanliness is next to godliness. But for arc welding like this, you can burn through a lot of stuff. Now, I know, again, this is practical common sense welding. This is not how to do every single kind of weld in the world. I just have a couple of pieces of steel set here. One of them is just a piece of angle iron, which in fact, the way I have them here is not very good to show you. So let me switch this around. Now I'm going to use welding clamps. These are vice grip. We call them welding clamps anyway. And you just grab a hold of your piece of metal like that and clamp it to your work surface if you have a welding table. Now if you don't have a welding table, do you have to have one? No, you don't need to have a welding table. You could do this right down on the concrete floor, but you'd have to have some way to kind of keep these together. So in that case, you might want to just take a piece of metal that you could just clamp both of these to, and you're just going to weld the top surface. It's just any kind of common sense method to get them put together so you can weld them. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about is what kind of a welding rod do you need to weld steel? And there's a gazillion kinds of welding rods. Let me just boil it down to this. Just get yourself some 6011. That's what it's called, 6011, 6011 welding rod, and you're pretty much good to go. You can pretty much weld just about any kind of steel with this stuff. Again, there's people screaming at the video right now, but just ignore them. Just listen to what I'm telling you. We're just talking common sense, not perfection. The 6011 will weld easily for you. So since you're a beginner, this welds probably easier than just about any rod out there. And you don't have to have it turned up super hot. So with the 6011 rod, you can generally weld at around 75 to 90. That's your typical welder is going to have that range. I will tell you that I've run across a few cheap welders that their numbers were way hot. You had to turn them up way hotter. On almost any kind of reasonable welder, like this Arc Captain, or the old Lincoln Buzz box like this. In fact, you can see here, they got the 75 is circled, which is a fairly common amperage. Here's a 90 also. So between 75 and 90 amps is really pretty good for just your average welding. Now, if you're getting into heavier, thicker stuff, something that needs to be much stronger, well, then you're going to want to use a different rod and you're going to want to use different settings. And we'll get into that at a later time in a different video. But for today's purposes, since we're talking just common sense and weld almost anything you can come up to, we're just going to use the 6011 and just 2 pieces of just random steel. So there you go. And if you're wondering about the 6011, the rod will have it stamped on it right there too. And I doubt you're going to see this because this is not set up for that. But anyway, there is a 6011 right there. And one more thing about the 6011 rod, you can get it in multiple sizes. I keep it in a 1/8 inch rod size and I think it's 3/32. So it's a little smaller. Now if you're going to weld something thin, light, then you're going to want to use the lighter, thinner rod. Common sense, right? Just makes sense. So if you happen to be burning through whatever it is you're welding, like burning holes through it and melting it, then probably you have your amperage turned up too high, or maybe you're staying too long in one place, or a combination of both of those things. But anyway, these 2 rods here will take you a long way. 6011, 1/8 inch, and 3/32. For this kind of steel, which is, it's not quite a 1/4 inch thick, this is like a lawnmower blade, so you kind of know how thick a lawnmower blade is. And this is a little bit thinner piece of angle iron that I'm going to weld it to. I'm going to go ahead and use the 1/8 inch rod. I'm sure I could weld this with this smaller rod as well. Again, you don't have to put a ton of thought into this stuff. This little Art Captain welder will plug in anywhere. You can see it just has a standard plug. So I'm going to plug it in. I'm colorblind. It's really hard for me to read the number, but it looks like it says 85. So that's pretty good. That's in our range. It's kind of trial and error. We're just going to try that. If it works, great. And if it doesn't, we'll adjust. You want to have a welding helmet? Now I'm using my Andeli welding helmet, which they sent to me. And I like this welding helmet a lot. I will tell you right now, it's already burned up 2 batteries. Those are the 2032 batteries. It's already used 2 of them, and I haven't used the helmet that much. So my vote's out on this in terms of how long the batteries last, but the helmet itself is a very nice helmet. I would make a fairly strong recommendation that you get a decent helmet. You don't have to have the best helmet out there, but a decent helmet. And I would recommend getting the auto darkening helmet because it just makes your life simpler. Because you can be looking through this and seeing what you're doing, and then the moment you strike an arc, it gets dark. So that's what I would recommend. The typical setting for me on these auto darkening helmets, I set them at about 11 or between 11 and 12, just to give you some idea. I'm going to turn the welder off for a second here because I want to demonstrate this before we actually start welding. Arc welding is a strike. You have to kind of get a little bit of a strike. So you kind of maybe just do this and you kind of lift as you do it. And then, but you have to get controlled on that. You can't just do this and lift way up. That won't do you any good. You just kind of lift, just slightly arc and lift just a little bit. And then you've got to learn to keep, kind of keep a little bit of a puddle, and you'll see the metal melt, and it'll make a little bit of a puddle. And then basically what you're going to do is in a slight circular motion, you're going to drag that puddle backwards, kind of like this. You're just working in a small semicircle, and you just drag your puddle backwards like that. You can push it also, but there's just lots of different techniques. It's much easier probably starting out to just drag your puddle. Keep your rod fairly straight up and down, but it doesn't have to be perfectly straight up and down. Probably the most common mistake that beginners make when they're trying to weld is they try to go too fast. They get the arc started and then they start going really fast down there. Just take your time. Now, if you're burning through, well, then maybe you're taking too much time. But you just you can watch your puddle. Don't get overly excited. Just take your time, watch your puddle, and just make small motions and bring it back and just keep dragging it backwards. That's what I'm going to be doing here. Hopefully you can kind of see that in the video. My friends, one more safety aspect. Now, I'll be honest with you, I never wore welding gloves ever. For the first 40 years of my welding, I just did it barehanded. But I learned better, and having welding gloves is a good idea. Just any good pair of leather gloves is fine, but you can get welding gloves like at Harbor Freight, and they work and do the job pretty well. Okay, I just welded a short distance there to kind of show you how that works. So you can we'll give you a look at that weld now. And that's not cleaned up or anything, that's just the weld as it is. Now, generally speaking, you want to knock your slag off. Just take a hammer and knock the slag off like that. The coating on the welding rod lays over the top of that. Let me get a wire brush. That would probably be another accessory you're going to want to have, is a welding hammer. And a lot of them come with a wire brush attached. This one, I just made this out of an old file, and it works. And then I just use a regular wire brush. And so we're just going to clean that off like that. And now you can see how well it welded. And you can see there it did a pretty decent job. That is not going to come apart. You couldn't break that apart right now if you wanted to. I mean, don't get me wrong, you can use enough force and break it. But I mean, just with your hands or just any normal use, this is not going to break already. It's just that simple. There's nothing more to it than that. Don't let it intimidate you. Just get after it and give it a shot. Just get you some 6011, get you a little arc welder like this, and set it between 70 and 90 and go to town. Just practice. You know, what are you going to hurt? You're not going to hurt a thing. Just make sure you got a good ground. Always make sure you got a good ground. Now, if you don't have a welding table like this, then you would want to have to clamp your ground right to your item you're welding like this. But because we had this clamped, we had the ground clamp on the table, and we had this clamped to the table, it was grounded perfectly well. That's about all we're going to show you for lesson number 1.
So, my friends, I hope you enjoyed lesson number 1. If you did, give me a thumbs up. And if you have not yet subscribed, be sure to subscribe, because we're going to do a few more videos in this series and teach you a little bit more about welding. And this is all going to be common sense, not the real technical stuff, as you can already tell. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you on the next video.